in both cases took 3 or 4 attempts to really kind of nail that international growth trajectory. Just really refining how we're going to market, which customers are we attacking, what's the value proposition, why is it different in Australia to what it is internationally. Yeah, so that's probably my biggest takeaway, and having seen that play out, we see that a lot of other companies we're associated with as well. You've got to be quite thoughtful about when you transition overseas, exactly which segments, what's the go-to-market proposition, and be constantly thinking, how and why is it different to what I kind of expect it to be based on my experience, and in some ways your kind of your subconscious biases, I think.
Welcome to Growth Unlocked, Beyond Scale, your gateway to the deeper dimensions of business and personal growth. This series goes beyond traditional metrics, exploring the philosophies, mindsets, habits, and life lessons from those who've successfully navigated the landscape of entrepreneurship and leadership. Peer into the minds of those who've mastered the art of business innovation, partnerships, and those that are rewriting the rules of revenue. Tap into their actionable advice and practical playbooks that can be used to unlock growth in your own world.
Welcome back to another episode of Growth Unlocked. I'm your host, Kieran Cron. Today, we're chatting with a seasoned leader who's seen it all, CFO, CEO, and now founder. Paul Perrett has been at the helm of some of the biggest acquisitions in the Aussie tech scene and is here to share some of his insights on scaling a business, navigating high-stakes decisions, and turning challenges into billion-dollar opportunities. Paul, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries. Love that. Good to chat.
Let's do it. So, Paul, you've transitioned from CFO to CEO when you were at Message Media and later founded Firmable, where you are today.
Yep.
What motivated you to shift from finance to the broader leadership role, and how did your experience as a CFO shape your approach as a CEO?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was actually a chemical engineer by background once upon a time. So I haven't got a traditional kind of finance background, but in my journey through kind of business, I guess I kind of started as a strategy consultant, always had a bit of an analytical bent. I guess I'd always thought about businesses in terms of the economic engine, how does that work? And stepping in, so that's always been my kind of frame of reference. I've always, even though I was head of sales at GuT&x, I always kind of had a very strong kind of thinking and alignment around the more financial kind of commercial aspects of the business. And particularly when you couple that with the way that a CFO role is getting broader and broader these days, it was kind of a natural step for me at that point to kind of step into a, have a bit, slightly different role, but was still very kind of commercial in nature. So that was kind of the transition to a CFO. And then, I think I think understanding and having a strong kind of commercial framework, financial framework, that's what every founder needs, really. So, it was a natural step, and I think and I learned a lot as well, which was great.
Yeah, definitely. And I can imagine having that sort of like looking at things through a different lens and framing things through different roles has been like really beneficial in terms of, founding a company and getting to where you are today. How do you think those different perspectives has influenced your leadership style and I guess decision-making overall?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that the broader your experience, the more you kind of have a holistic understanding of kind of things. And also it just gives you a bit of confidence to go, okay, well, I know I can dive deep into that if I need to, but I don't necessarily have to when it comes to a founding kind of scenario where you're kind of more hands-on. So I just think it just gives you a much better perspective on the breadth of what you're trying to do, and also the kind of the organization and the the capability and the and the business you're trying to build. So so it's definitely something that and particularly in tech, I think it's particularly and in Australia, it's I would always encourage people to try and get as broader experience as possible, because I just think it just gives you such a great perspective on kind of building businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I could imagine there's so much you've taken away in terms of both of those different roles now that you're running Firmable. So definitely keen to dig into that at some point. I wanted to sort of circle back to some of your sort of previous history, like prior to prior to actually starting Firmable, you're, like I mentioned at the start of the call, you've been part of some pretty large acquisitions too, namely in the Aussie tech scene with Message Media getting bought for about 1.7 billion, and then GuT&x, I think about 1.6, so two unicorns, which is pretty impressive.
Yep.
What do you believe are the key factors that set these companies on the path to such extraordinary exits?
Yeah, I think no two story is the same, and they were really different businesses, of course. One was a kind of a vertically specific kind of SaaS play, which had a very much an enterprise kind of sales motion, whereas GuT&x, of course, and Message Media was, kind of a CPaaS kind of messaging, very much high transaction, very digitally led. So very, very different businesses. I think a couple of things set them apart, and I think that's and I think if you look at some of the businesses that have really done really well out of Australia, I think they had a very strong foundation in Australia. It's a very strong, profitable franchises, kind of growth engines out of their core home markets, a very strong kind of core home markets, and then I think in both cases had established a really kind of clear and distinctive kind of global kind of leadership position in their particular segments. So I think there's a combination of those two things. So that really strong Australian presence, which gives you great economics, then also transitioning internationally, which gives you obviously opportunity size, kind of really, really broadens the TAM. And I also think GuT, in both cases, in very different ways, were able to tell a really clear narrative about what their market leadership position was and why they would continue to win and continue to prosper, I think, in the segments they were in.
Yeah, absolutely. So really being laser focused on, being the leader, market leader within Australia and the region that you start in before looking at that international expansion. For the GTM leaders and other execs that might be tuning in, I know like both those different businesses were quite different, like you mentioned, in terms of their actual go-to-market model, but are there any maybe like things that come to mind that would be transferable that other founders that might be looking to scale internationally should be considering?
Yeah, I think, and again, very different context, but probably there was the same lesson that, particularly and it's a bit of a simplification, but in Australia you tend to service all sorts of customers of all different types, just because of the nature of the market, right? You tend to be a leading player, and you tend to service a really broad set of customers, which is great. I think that's really beneficial. Often what you find when you go in the US is any other big market is suddenly the market's a bit more nuanced, and it's more, the niches are more pronounced and they're bigger. So really thinking through, okay, I used to service this type of customer. Actually, in the US, our ideal customer profile might change slightly. Whether it's the nature of the market, the nature of the competition, the size of the market, and that played out really clearly in both GuT&x and Message Media, and took us. And to be honest, it took us. In both cases, took 3 or 4 attempts to really kind of nail that international growth trajectory. Just really refining how we're going to market, which customers are we attacking, what's the value proposition, why is it different in Australia to what it is internationally. So I think it's so that's probably my biggest takeaway, and having seen that play out. I mean, we see that a lot of other companies we're associated with as well. It's there's you've got to be quite thoughtful about when you transition overseas, exactly which segments, what's the go-to-market proposition, and be constantly thinking, how and why is it different to what I kind of expect it to be based on my, my experience, and in some ways your subconscious biases, I think.
Yeah, I think that subconscious bias is something that we all need to be mindful of, because I can imagine that some leaders get caught into the trap of thinking, if it's worked well over here, it should do the same thing if I replicate that over in another market. And so,
yeah, and there's just some things you just take for granted. It's just some things you just don't even realize you're assuming because they're so ingrained about what's kind of made you successful. So I think sometimes there's just some unspoken assumptions or some So I think it's just being really thoughtful about how you go to market internationally. And I think the other thing too is you've got to treat it like when you're early in your kind of your journey, you're really tuned into feedback. And you're often, as a founder or an early, you're really out there with the customer, and those feedback loops are really strong and really direct. I think the big trap you can make when you're going internationally is you often got a much bigger team at that point. So the feedback loop is 2 or 3 steps removed, So there's just absolutely no substitute for people, as a founder or a leader, just getting out there in the market and just making sure you really are getting good feedback about what the customer's saying, how things are playing out on the ground. Because it's not so often you're out in a meeting and you go, oh, well, that was odd. Such and such, I asked this, they said that. They were really interested in this. I've never had anyone who's interested in that before. And it's that curiosity about what the customer is saying, which I think can often really help inform, really nailing that kind of positioning in an international market.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it sounds like what you were doing there is, even though the company was growing, and as you mentioned, you had a couple of layers of kind of management in between you and the customer, you were still actually spending time with your customers to understand how they were feeling and what the sentiment was.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't, so absolutely, you've got to be out there as much as possible. In the case of GuT&x, we weren't really successful in that international expansion until probably, half of the senior leadership of the team moved to the market. So, and actually lived and breathed the market day to day. And that was, I think there was lots of things I think that eventually got us, to be in a great position in the US. But that I think was pretty fundamental to it. Not to say that you have to move your entire executive team, but it's just really being thoughtful about what your feedback loops are, time in market. And it's even the types of people you have, like some sales leaders, sales reps are really good at distilling feedback and others are not. So I always used to almost have a mental list of people I would just call regularly to touch base with every week and go, hey, X, how's your week been? Who have you been talking to? What sort of meetings have you had? And it was just a casual conversation, and just having those conversations that you would often have around the office, but just making the point of reaching out to people who are curious and insightful about the market, I think is super helpful.
Yeah, agreed. It's a really valid point. Putting the focus a bit onto message media for a second. So, that acquisition was pretty impressive and obviously quite a significant milestone. What would you say would be your top 2 or 3 learnings from that journey specifically that other leaders and GTM founders should know about when sort of going through a similar phase, maybe preparing for an acquisition or a merger?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, there's always lots of learnings, lots of things you do well. And, I think in all these things, it's a combination of, a good strategy, good execution and, in some cases, good timing and good luck, right? so I think you probably need all 4 to have a great outcome. And we certainly, I think we certainly did a lot of things well, but we also had, we got our timing right. And we're also really fortunate that, COVID drove this, kind of digitization drive, which we were able to, or tailwind, if you like, we were really able to kind of take advantage of. But I think there's a few kind of lessons. One lesson, probably the key thing really that we got right in the early days of that, when I came in, and it was part of alongside Mercury Capital, who were, kind of the private equity group that came in. We spent a lot of time trying to distill almost what the economic engine was of the business. Like, it was quite a tricky business in that it had cohorts that had variable usage consumptions, and you had customers that started small and got big, and they were sporadic customers, and we had lots of brands and we had lots of markets, and we had customers that were everything from gyms, florists through to Afterpay, right? So it was a massive range of customers. So it was quite a complex business to understand. Okay, well, given that shape and complexity, what are the important things that we need to do? Like, how do we structure our, how do we think about retaining and growing customers versus what actually do we want to do on a new customer perspective? And then, so really kind of getting quite granular about what the economic engine was in terms of where growth was coming from. And then, okay, well, if that's where growth's coming from and these are the buckets, where do we invest to try and, yes, we can invest down here in growing the existing base, but is that actually going to move the needle, or really are we best into doubling down into new customer acquisition? So it was really that exercise of just coming up with and as much as anything, it was a model to help explain it to the team, so as a management team, we go, okay, here's the way our business works. Here's a very simple way of describing it. Here's where we need to get to. How can we break that down? So I think that was probably, in some senses, and it sounds simple, but just understanding how you drove growth in that business. That was, I think one of the key things. And then the second thing, which probably all successful businesses, it's really about getting the right people. So it was about making sure that you had a senior leadership team and a team that was really kind of aligned on where they were going, and also kind of capable of executing that. So that meant bringing in new leadership, and particularly internationally, and just making sure that team was kind of equipped for the journey, but also kind of really aligned around what we were doing. So they were probably two things.
They're great learnings. And I'd love to dig into that second point, particularly around leadership, because we all know that, great businesses depend on great people. And I think that something that I've learned through being a leader myself as well is it is really difficult, or it can be very challenging to find the right people for the right role. And it doesn't always work out. We all make mistakes and I think we all learn from them. But I'd love to get your kind of like thinking around what were the kind of attributes or kind of soft skills or personality types that you would be testing for or looking for when you were hiring people as you were growing these companies?
Yeah, it's very, particularly at a senior level, and I think boards often fall into the trap of this, and they go, or founders do as well. They go, I know that we really need to scale sales and marketing, so let's go out and. Or the board's saying, you really need to do that. And you go, well, okay, let's go out and find someone really senior and experienced who's done that, right? And that can be a real trap. So there's a real art to, I think, getting someone who has enough experience and capability and headroom to go on the journey, but still is able to, be day-to-day driving the business, right? Because, and I've, we've made the mistake number of times over the journey, you can hire senior people who just don't fit what you need to do. So we had an example really back in the early days of GuT&x where we, went out and hired a really senior US sales leader to drive our US expansion. And she was fantastic at what she had done, but she came from an organization where she had a compensation team that did all the comp planning, and she had a territory planning team, and she had all these things, and it was a poor hire from our perspective. But it was just really reinforced. You've actually got to have people who I think can do it from first principles. So you've got to have experience, and a bit of pattern recognition is really helpful, but you ultimately need people who are strong first principles thinkers. That's kind of always been my take, because every situation is different, right? So yes, it's good to have a CMO who's seen a few things before, but at the end of the day, you don't want a CMO who comes in and goes, this is my playbook and I'm going to apply that to my new business, because it may not work, right? There's almost always subtleties and nuances, and every business is different. So, I've got a very strong bias towards first principle thinkers. That's the first thing. And then, and the other thing, and we've been really fortunate at both GuT&x and Message Media to have, I think you need confidence, but you also need humility, right? So people who in the team are good at working with others, and actually don't need to be the loudest voice in the room, don't need to have all the answers. I think having a team that has low ego, I think is tremendously important.
Yeah, it's a really important one, because I think that ego can kind of get in the way of making the right decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's huge. I want to go back to the point you made around first principles thinking, because I think that's very interesting. How would you have tested for that throughout an interview process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. How do you test for that? Depends a bit on the role, of course. I think you can kind of sense it particularly when people so when you're talking about the business and people start to lean in and ask questions. So I try and keep, and this is not something you necessarily do in the first chat, but as you're getting deeper into the process, you kind of almost try and get to the point where you can have the equivalent, you don't have to have a whiteboard, but just have the equivalent of let me talk through, and candidates are often, nearly always, really keen to understand the business, right? So you can kind of get into a conversation about the business and just kind of start to see how they connect the dots or inferences they make or the next question. So I think that starts to give you a bit of a sense of how they do it. I think, and just start to, I think you can, if you have that in your mind as to what are the signals that someone can think their way through a problem, and how do they engage when you talk to someone. I think if you have that frame of reference in your mind as you're having a discussion with someone, it can become it's relatively easy to pick up, I think.
I guess you probably got the benefit of having had a lot of different interviews and spoken to a lot of people in your days, and your
That's a bit of bad
intuition.
recognition. Yeah, that's a bit of bad recognition. Yeah, that's probably true.
But I think listening to your gut, it sounds so simple, but I think it's one of those kind of things that generally, like, if there's this, slight weird feeling in your gut where you're like, not 100% sure, or there was something there, like, usually if you do hire that person, comes out later and down the line.
Yeah, I think some roles are easier to pick that than others. Like if you're doing a product role, that's relatively easy, and they often are, but it's sales roles is often hard because sales leaders are great at presenting, right? That's why they're great sales leaders. So I find picking that in sales leaders is hard. And also sales leaders are not necessarily going to be the biggest first principle thinkers, right? So nor do they have the luxury of spending a lot of time doing that generally in their roles, right? So it is difficult, more difficult in some roles than others, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely nuance to it for sure. So Lee Jasper mentioned the importance of, I guess, separating oneself from the business, which is probably quite difficult to do, particularly when you're a founder, especially when it comes to the emotional toll of high stakes decisions. How do you personally manage the pressure and stress that would come with leading a company through really transformative phases?
Yeah, it's I think and Lee's really good at this actually. Have you worked with him a lot? I think it's a really good topic that I don't think gets talked about enough. You see a lot of founders who are very naturally, highly emotionally invested in their business, which is great, right? As founders should be. And it's really easy to say. It's massively easy to say. Much harder to kind of mentally, kind of internally remind yourself. You're not defined by the success or failure of your business as a founder, right? Like you are a person with a whole range of things you do in life. And yes, your business is a very important part of your identity, but it's not. It is not your identity. So I think that's something that, the risk of getting slightly philosophical, like it's just reminding yourself of that a little bit. And I think, and again, this is much easier as you have a bit of experience, but the highs are never quite as high as you think they are, and the lows are never quite as low as you think they are either. So it's just having a little bit of perspective on that, I think, is helpful. I think it's helpful. I think being a solo founder would be really hard, actually. Or harder, maybe. Having people on the journey you can share it with, I think, is important. So I think that's one way of managing it, because it can be a pretty lonely journey. I also think, making sure you continue to invest and remember, the things in your non-work life, right? So, and it's the risk of being philosophical. Like, when you go home to your young child and, they don't care. So, they don't care if you're coaching your 8-year-old's basketball team, they don't care whether you're a founder, a millionaire, or whatever you are. They don't care. They care that you're there and, you're hanging out with them and you're trying to help them get better at basketball, right? So I think it's, I think having experiences in your life and people in your life that kind of keep you a little bit grounded is really important. So again, easy to say. I kind of get all that, but I think having a bit of perspective on life, I think, helps you carry that a bit more easily, and I think ultimately makes you a much more effective decision maker as well. So,
yeah, it's like you said. I think it's probably easier said than done.
Exactly. One of those advice you're like, oh, sure, it's easy for you to say. So.
Have you found that, a lot of people that I speak to, often the common thread that I see is having that perspective often comes through having, say, like a mentor or someone that's kind of outside of the sphere or the business that you're operating in. Has that been similar for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think and it's interesting actually, having the Firmable experience more recently, people kind of say, oh, how's it going? And you kind of like, well, good, I think. So you constantly feel a bit schizophrenic about it, right? So it's, that bit's really good, but gee, that bit's, not so good, and we need to do some work on, and oh, wow, that's a real problem we've got to fix. And so I think it's really helpful to have outside perspective on stuff to precisely go, look, you're actually doing okay. Yep, sure, that's a big problem you got to fix, but you're not the only one who's had that. And yep, like just having someone, who And I think founders should do a better job of connecting with other founders as well, because I think that can be really helpful to kind of go, okay, this is my journey. Gee, this is hard. How did you find that? And they go, yeah, that's really hard. So I think that's there's something that we talk a little bit about. Like, I think just a bit of founder empathy can go a long way to making everyone feel, feel a little bit, kind of nourished in a sense, and kind of ready to keep pushing on. So,
yeah, absolutely. I guess sort of pivoting a little bit to switch gears and thinking about Firmable. I mean, I think a lot of the listeners are probably pretty keen to understand about that. I remember through one of our previous conversations, you mentioned how the idea originally sparked, or where that sort of plan was seeded from, through some of the data enrichment and the things that you're working on at Message Media. Do you mind talking people through a little bit about that kind of origin story in terms of where the initial idea came from, in terms of that problem that you had, and how things have developed from that?
Yeah, I think even going back to the Actionable days, I guess just for context for how I think about the world, which may already have come through, but I think about how you build businesses as a bit of a system, like how do you put the bits in place that enable you to build businesses that are repeatable, scalable, so that's kind of how I think about things. So I'm a builder by nature. At GuT&x, we built a view of every single construction project on the planet. So we kind of ingested all this data to build this data asset, which was every construction project on the planet, to help drive, inform how we deployed our sales resources, how we engaged. So we really tried to systemize how we took external data and applied it to our sales and marketing motion. So that's kind of where we started thinking about it. Then at Message Media, which was very different, high transaction, high velocity, big inbound, we used to get thousands of inbound leads a month. And I'd be sitting there with a team and asking the obvious questions. I'd be like, okay, well, how do I know whether that's a $5 a month customer or a $1,000 a month customer? And the guys would be like, well, it's really hard. What we started to do is to try kind of enriching that a little bit with some of the available existing data sources. And, this is kind of sales intelligence is a category that, there are some, good kind of established players who've been in the market for a while. And it's not that they do a bad job, but they were like, okay, well, we could probably get employee numbers, or maybe we could get revenue, although probably not because they're smaller. And I'm like, well, employee numbers doesn't really tell me whether a company's likely to be a big sender of messaging, right? So, what I want to know is, are they B2B or B2C, or, what's the size of their database? Like, that's probably the best proxy for, likely message volume. So, we had a bit of a workshop, and we're like, actually, how can we? So then we're like, all right, so how can we get a proxy for database size? So we're like, well, actually, social media following and social media presence is probably a really natural one. So what we ended up doing, back in the day, was building a little team in the Philippines, which for every inbound lead, kind of went through and kind of rated against these. I think we had 7 or 8 different firmographic dimensions. What's their social media presence? What's their website traffic? What industries, what tech stack, blah, 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 blah. So there was a whole set of stuff that we kind of profiled every lead through, which then both allowed us to, think through how we handle those leads, but also allowed us to start to iterate on, okay, well, what can we do differently from a messaging, marketing perspective to get more of these and less of those, right? So that was kind of, so we were in a sense forced to go and build our own sources of external data. So that was really what and Lee thinks, and Karthik both think about data a lot as well, and they kind of they came at it from other perspectives. But we sat there and went, you know what, the next wave of, I think, you think about all the things that have happened in sales and marketing over the last 20 years. I think one of the things that's really going to drive change in the sales and marketing profession is really great external data that can really help you then drive better internal decision making. So that was the kind of the premise of it. And then you kind of go, well, how do you get great data? And then we went, you know what, actually, the big global players are a little bit hamstrung in that they can really only go surface level deep. So they're wide and shallow in a sense. What we want to do is build, the definitive, the best, pick however you describe it, the deepest set of firmographic data on Australian businesses to really help drive kind of great decision making. So so that was kind of a little bit, kind of how we started working into the problem space.
Mm. Yeah, it's really cool to see how you identified a problem that you wanted to solve for yourself, for your own use case, and then you start to think about, this is probably not the only business that's experiencing this problem.
Exactly.
Let's scale this out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned that, sometimes you're wondering how things are going, sometimes good, sometimes certain areas need some work.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about things today?
Yeah, good day today. So I'm kind of on the upswing today. So it's overall really positive. I think, you'd always be wanting to do more and be, going quicker and all those types of things. I think what's been fantastic is just the feedback we're receiving in the market. So, I guess our initial, kind of hypothesis that there was this great market need for better data to drive their, or better, higher quality, better data to drive their kind of sales and marketing process. That, that's been borne out 100 times over. So the feedback and the pain point that we kind of sensed is definitely there. I think the market opportunity is kind of bigger than we thought as well, which is great. We're also in this, so we started the business before, I guess, the explosion of Gen AI as well. So there's a real point in time, I think, in, what's happening in sales and marketing, which I think actually makes better data and, the role of external data and how you kind of orchestrate your sales and marketing activities. I think that makes that even more pertinent than possibly we could even have imagined. And not to mention makes assembling the data sets a lot easier. So we're feeling, lots to do, plenty of things to fix. But I think we're really pleased with where we're going. We're getting great momentum. We've got a great set of customers who are jumping on board, giving us feedback, advocating for us, building a great ecosystem of people out there, I think, who are really keen to help us collectively kind of solve this problem.
For sure. And I think the thing that I've really enjoyed coming along a part of this journey is how open you guys are to feedback, and like us forming this kind of partnership around, obviously sort of we play in the CRM space, and I personally think that any business that's going to be using a CRM or wants to use it effectively really needs to have quality data that's trustworthy and reliable. And it's been awesome working with you and your team in terms of taking on some of that feedback with the integration with HubSpot. And so I really think that there's a great opportunity here for businesses like us to partner together. And I guess the partner ecosystem is something that I'm sure you know really well from both your days at Message Media and now at Firmable as well.
Yeah, like 100%. And you've been very kind to us over the years. So thank you, Kieran. We appreciate it. I think one of the things that's really struck me is how important the ecosystem in the sales and marketing world is, because if you think about what's happening in sales and marketing, it's getting more and more complex, I think. So if you're, and the number of conversations we have with companies who are like, want to grow, but I'm really struggling. It's getting more complicated. How do I do this? Like, it's just, I think the role of experts in, whether it's in your CRM space or your outreach space or your digital marketing, like I think the role of partners and experts to support and surround companies and really help them, support them on their growth journey is so critical. And I think it's becoming even more critical, which I think is great for us, right? Because you end up with this network of people, I think, who are, pretty tapped into what's going on out there. And I think it becomes a bit of a mutually kind of reinforcing, kind of process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For the listeners, Paul, that are tuned in that might be aspiring to scale their business, what is the top, I guess, 2 or 3 actionable steps you think that they could start to take today to ensure they're on the right path to sustainable growth and a potential acquisition if that's what they're looking for?
Yeah, I think, and it's kind of where we started, I guess, of the conversation, is having just absolute clarity on how you grow your business and what the economic engine is. Are you, so I think, for instance, for Firmable, I think naturally when people use data, they kind of come in and out a little bit. Sometimes they need more or less. And, so I think as a business, we are going to probably find it easy to acquire customers, and that's already proving out. But you will have you'll have customers that some will have intermittent use and, some will be long-term users. And so you'll have a mixture of customers. So I think our our economics are going to be low cost of acquisition, probably slightly higher churn rates than you would have if you were an ERP business, where you probably have high cost of customer acquisition and low churn rates. So I think being really clear on what it is you have to do to drive your kind of economic engine. So if we want to go, we're 2 million, whatever you are, you're 5 million, what does getting to 10 million look like for us? Are we just, is getting from 5 to 10 million for us, is that 5 million of new customers? Or is that 6 million of new customers and we lose 1 million of our customers? Or is it that we've already got all the customers we need, we just need to expand the wallet? So I think being really clear about that, and then, having the right framework around that, and then being able to, as you talk to people about it and are raising money and saying, look, this is how we work. This is the opportunity. Excellent. This is our progress. Great. But we understand what will really scale and grow our business. I think that's if there's one thing that and we see a lot of pictures, through a lot of the investing activities stuff we do as well. And that's probably the one thing that I think founders are not always great at. They often, or generally, and maybe this is just a table stake thing, generally pretty intuitive about their market. They're generally pretty good at explaining the pain points of the opportunity, but it's okay. Show me you understand how it works when, what's the pathway to really double your business or triple your business or whatever it is. So that's probably the biggest thing, I think.
Nice. That's great advice. It got me thinking about something that, is really relevant in this day and age, is obviously like capital efficiency is one of the most important parts of growing and scaling a business. And I guess with your experience, both having the kind of CFO hat on and being like at the CEO helm and then founding companies, how do you think about that, like that capital efficiency? Like, what's your perspective on that now that things have changed, obviously, with capital being more expensive and harder to come by? Has that sort of reframed anything for you, or has that changed your perspective on anything at all?
I think, and maybe, when we, back in the GuT&x day, we're always a bit old school, and there was kind of before, the rise of the big venture capital scene in Australia, and, we always had a view that, you needed to have a clear pathway to profitability, right? So, and you might choose, as you got to profitability, that you were like, actually, we've now got this great opportunity over here we want to go and invest in. So you kind of, lead calls it porpoising, which is not a bad way to describe it. So I think we've always kind of had that kind of mindset, I guess. So I think, I don't know, our world has changed as much because that's kind of always been the frame that we've lived in. But I think, there was a set of businesses or founders that kind of raised money in a time when I don't think there was a realism around kind of ultimately yes, you've been able to raise $50 million, yes, it's a great opportunity, but can you actually deploy it? So can you actually it's one thing, I think, to raise a lot of money, but then you've actually got to be able to use it well. So which can be harder than you think, I think, sometimes, because there's really only as a founding team or an exec team, you do have a limited bandwidth to do things, and you've got to pick the 2 or 3 things that are important. So I think that's often how I see it, that people just try and do too much and then probably try and, as a consequence, spend too much. So I think it's having a bit of discipline around what you don't do as much as what you do, I think. So.
Yeah, great point. Awesome. Paul, lastly, I guess to round things out, where can people, follow you, find out more about Firmable? What's the best channel and best place for them to do that? Yeah,
so like always, I'm very happy to chat to anyone who wants to talk go-to-market and sales. Like that's one of the things actually I love about, Firmable is we get to stay really close and current to what's happening out there in the market. So, I'm always up for a chat, always up. And I guess our approach, as you touched on, we're pretty open and transparent. So even if someone just wants advice, or just our feedback or perspective on stuff, really, really open to that. So come and check us out at firmable.com. Ping me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. And as I said, please reach out if you think it might be interesting to chat or if we could help.
Awesome. Paul, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time today.
No worries. Thanks, Kieran.
Cheers. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Growth Unlocked Beyond Scale. If you enjoyed the show, it would really be appreciated if you can leave a 5-star review wherever you consume your podcasts. And while you're there, Why not subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes? If you'd like to learn about how to drive profitable scale in your business, gain clarity on your direction, and improve your business valuation, click the link in the show notes to connect with Kieran.